The salty breeze rolled off the sea, carrying with it the whispers of crashing waves and the faint scent of sunscreen and sun-drenched sand. It was an idyllic coastal town, the kind of place tourists flocked to for a break from their mundane lives. Wooden boardwalks creaked under the weight of flip-flopped feet. Colorful stalls lined the pier selling everything from fresh-caught seafood to gaudy souvenirs. And laughter bubbled from families soaking in the warmth of a golden afternoon. But beneath the postcard-perfect veneer, a cloud of unease clung to the town like the fog that crept in during early mornings. Sarah Henderson gripped her coffee mug tighter as she stared out from the small diner where she worked, her reflection faintly visible against the smudged window pane. At first glance, Sarah looked like any other woman in her late 40s. A worn apron tied around her waist, her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, and faint crow's feet framing her brown eyes. But behind her composed demeanor, there was an ache, a lingering shadow of grief that no amount of time seemed to heal. 22 years had passed, yet it felt like yesterday when her life had been shattered in an instant. That summer had started, like any other, with her husband, Daniel, and their spirited 9-year-old daughter, Emily, heading off for a road trip to a quiet beach they had visited every year. The plan had been simple. Sarah would stay behind for a work commitment and join them a few days later. Only, that reunion never happened. Daniel and Emily had disappeared without a trace. Their car found abandoned on a stretch of remote highway miles from the beach. The authorities had combed through every lead, every tip, every possible explanation. But nothing made sense. There were no signs of foul play, no demands for ransom, no evidence pointing to their fate. It was as though the earth had swallowed them whole, leaving Sarah clutching unanswered questions and a grief too heavy to bear. The sound of a plate clattering against the counter pulled Sarah back to the present. "Order up," Hank called from the kitchen, his gruff voice tinged with concern as he glanced at her. He didn't need to ask what was on her mind. Everyone in this small town knew Sarah's story. She was the woman with the missing family, the one who'd never remarried, never left, and never stopped hoping, no matter how faint the hope had grown over the years. As Sarah turned to grab the plate, she felt it again. The stares, the same hushed whispers and sideways glances that had followed her ever since the disappearance. Most people meant no harm. They were simply curious, caught up in the unsolved mystery that had haunted the town for 2 decades. But Sarah hated it. She hated being a ghost of someone else's tragedy, a living reminder of the unanswered. Her shift dragged on, each tick of the clock a reminder of the empty house waiting for her. By the time she stepped outside, the sky had darkened, and the first stars began to prick through the navy expanse. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter, the chill in the air cutting sharper than usual. The town felt eerily quiet tonight, as though the weight of an unspoken secret pressed down on it. When she arrived home, Sarah paused on the porch, her hand hovering over the door handle. The house stood like a time capsule, frozen in the year they vanished. Emily's drawing still adorned the fridge. Her old sneakers sat by the back door, and Daniel's favorite mug rested on the kitchen counter. Sarah couldn't bring herself to change anything, as if preserving their memories would somehow bring them back. Stepping inside, she was met with silence, the kind that had become her companion over the years. She switched on the light and shuffled to the kitchen, her tired eyes scanning the pile of unopened mail on the table. Bills, advertisements, more bills. It was the same routine every night. But as she sifted through the stack, her fingers froze on an envelope unlike the others. It was old, yellowed at the edges as if it had been sitting somewhere for years. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, and her heart began to pound as she read the return address. No name, just a location. A small town she had never heard of, hundreds of miles away. Sarah's hands trembled as she tore it open. Inside was a single piece of paper, the words scrawled in hurried, uneven handwriting. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the first line. "I know what happened to Daniel and Emily." The room seemed to tilt, and Sarah clutched the edge of the table to steady herself. Her pulse thundered in her ears as her eyes darted back to the letter. The words blurred together as 1,000 questions flooded her mind. Who had written this? Why now? And most importantly, could it be true? She sank into the nearest chair, the weight of the letter heavy in her hands. For the first time in years, Sarah felt something stirred deep within her, something she hadn't dared to feel in so long. Hope, but with it came fear. Fear of what she might uncover. Fear of reopening wounds that had never truly healed. And yet, she couldn't ignore it. She couldn't ignore the possibility that, after all this time, she might finally find answers. Sarah's fingers tightened around the letter as a single thought took root in her mind. She had to find out the truth. The clock ticked loudly in the silence, each second stretching unbearably long. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the sound sharp and jarring against the stillness of the night. But Sarah didn't move, her eyes fixed on the letter as if it held the key to everything she had lost. And for the first time in 22 years, the house no longer felt so empty. Sarah sat frozen at the kitchen table, the yellowed letter clutched in her trembling hands. The words on the page had seared into her mind, each one sparking 1,000 questions. After years of aching silence and unanswered prayers, this single line had shattered the quiet monotony of her grief. I know what happened to Daniel and Emily. But who had written it? And why now, after 22 agonizing years? The air in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the weight of her past had suddenly descended on her all at once. Her eyes drifted to the photograph on the counter, one she had stopped herself from putting away. It was from the summer before their disappearance, a family trip to the mountains. Daniel, with his easy smile and kind eyes, had his arm draped around Sarah's shoulders. Emily, all freckles and untamed curls, grinned into the camera, holding up the pine cone she'd insisted was her lucky charm. Sarah had never believed in luck, but Emily had. Good things happen if you just believe, Mama, she would say, her bright voice filled with an optimism that Sarah secretly envied. It was the kind of hope that had sustained her daughter through scraped knees and failed spelling tests. But it had vanished along with Emily that day, leaving Sarah to carry the weight of a shattered life all on her own. The next morning, Sarah found herself back at the diner, trying to shake off the haunting memory of the letter. The late morning crowd had started trickling in, regulars mostly, each with their routines. There was Mr. Carson, who ordered black coffee and eggs every day at exactly 9:15 a.m., and the Middleton sisters, whose weekly gossip sessions were as much a fixture of the diner as the cracked vinyl booths. Sarah moved through the motions like always, pouring coffee and scribbling down orders, but her mind kept circling back to the letter. She hadn't told anyone about it. Not yet. Not even Hank, who had become one of her closest confidants over the years. Hank was a retired police officer who had taken over the diner after his wife passed away. He was gruff and weathered, but kind in a way that reminded Sarah of her father. They had bonded in the quiet hours of the morning when the diner was still empty, sharing stories of their losses and regrets. When the breakfast rush finally tapered off, Hank leaned against the counter and gave Sarah a pointed look. "You've been off all morning," he said, wiping his hands on a towel. "Something on your mind?" Sarah hesitated, her fingers tightening around the coffee pot she was holding. She wanted to tell him about the letter, to unburden herself even just a little, but the words caught in her throat. What if it was nothing? What if this was just another cruel reminder of what she'd lost? "I didn't sleep well," she said, finally, forcing a small smile. Hank didn't press her, but his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than usual. "Well, get some rest tonight. You look like you're carrying the weight of the world." Later that afternoon, Sarah decided to visit her best friend Linda. If there was anyone who could help her make sense of this, it was Linda. The two women had been inseparable since high school, weathering every storm together. It was Linda who had sat by Sarah's side through endless nights of despair, who had convinced her to keep going when giving up felt like the only option. Linda's house was warm and inviting, with shelves cluttered with books and family photos. Her two golden retrievers, Max and Daisy, bounded to the door as Sarah stepped inside, their tails wagging furiously. Linda greeted her with a tight hug, immediately sensing her unease. "What's wrong?" she asked, ushering Sarah to the couch. Sarah took a deep breath and pulled the letter from her bag, handing it to Linda without a word. She watched as her friend's expression shifted from confusion to shock to something unreadable. "Where did you get this?" Linda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It came in the mail yesterday," Sarah said. "I don't know who sent it, or why." Linda's brow furrowed as she read the letter again. This could be real, Sarah. Someone might actually know something. Or it could be a cruel joke," Sarah said bitterly. "Do you know how many fake tips and dead ends I've chased over the years? How many times I let myself hope, only to have it ripped away?" Linda reached out and placed a hand on Sarah's knee. "I know you're scared, but what if this is real? What if this is the answer you've been waiting for?" Sarah looked away, her eyes welling with tears. What if it's not? By the time Sarah left Linda's house, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. She decided to take the scenic route home, driving past the edge of town where the rolling hills stretched endlessly toward the horizon. It was the same road Daniel and Emily had taken all those years ago. Her mind wandered back to the days following their disappearance, the endless search parties, the police interviews, and the way her life had unraveled piece by piece. She had blamed herself for years, convinced that if she had just gone with them, she could have stopped whatever had happened. But deep down, she knew that was a lie. As she approached the turnoff to her house, Sarah noticed something unusual. A car she didn't recognize was parked across the street, its engine idling. The windows were tinted, obscuring the driver from view. Sarah's heart raced as she pulled into her driveway, her eyes flicking to the car in her rearview mirror. She stepped out of her vehicle cautiously, her keys clutched tightly in her hand. The car didn't move, its engine humming softly in the distance. Sarah forced herself to look away, unlocking her front door and stepping inside. She stood in the entryway for a moment, listening for any sound from outside. But the car didn't follow. It just sat there, an ominous presence on the edge of her world. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The letter, the car, the memories. It all swirled together in a tangled mess of fear and confusion. She found herself pacing the living room, her thoughts racing. Finally, unable to take the silence any longer, she picked up her phone and dialed the number of the return address from the letter. Her hands trembled as the line rang once, then twice. On the third ring, someone picked up. "Hello?" A man's voice said, low and unfamiliar. Sarah's breath hitched. "I got your letter," she said, her voice barely steady. "Who are you?" There was a pause on the other end, followed by a deep sigh. "I can't explain everything over the phone," the man said. "But if you want to know the truth, meet me tomorrow. I'll send you the location." The line went dead before Sarah could respond. She stared at her phone, her heart pounding. This was it. The moment she had waited for, dreaded, and prayed for all at once. But as the tension mounted, one question loomed larger than any other. Was she ready to face the truth?